Day 17 of what was supposed to be a 9-day survey mission, and the expedition camp on Viridian 7 had descended into the kind of chaos that made excellent cautionary tales for future explorers. The supply shuttle, piloted by someone who definitely shouldn't have been piloting anything more complex than a food cart, had embedded itself in a rocky outcrop approximately 40 kilometers from base camp. With it went all the rations, the backup rations, and the emergency backup rations that regulations insisted they carry specifically for situations like this. The camp now resembled a slow-motion disaster populated by some of the galaxy's finest scientific minds who were collectively discovering that intelligence and survival skills occupied two very different slots on the evolutionary skill tree. Commander Velkoth, a Saurian whose scales had taken on a rather unhealthy grey tinge, paced between the prefabricated shelters with the frantic energy of someone watching their career prospects evaporate in real time. His species could survive weeks without food under normal circumstances, but stress metabolism was burning through his reserves at an alarming rate. Each lap around camp was punctuated by increasingly desperate communications with rescue coordination, who kept promising extraction soon with the kind of vagueness that suggested they were dealing with 17 other crises simultaneously. The rest of the crew wasn't faring much better. Zitkrik, the expedition's navigator and a member of the Chitix collective, huddled in her quarters, vibrating at a frequency that indicated severe distress. Her species subsisted entirely on nutrient paste of a specific chemical composition, and attempts to synthesize it from local materials had resulted in something that technically qualified as food in the same way that sewage technically qualified as water. She'd tried one spoonful and spent the next hour making sounds that universal translators struggled to process. Prism 5, the engineering officer and a crystalline who normally sustained herself through photosynthesis, stood in the planet's sunlight looking increasingly dim. Literally, her usual brilliant refraction had dulled to a cloudy translucence that suggested her internal processes were shutting down non-essential functions. Viridian 7's star output fell just outside her species' usable spectrum, which was the sort of detail that seemed trivial during mission planning, but became remarkably relevant when you were actually starving. Then there was Kelos, the aquatic biologist, who'd taken to spending most of his time in the portable tank in his quarters, conserving energy and occasionally emerging to ask if anyone had found anything edible yet. His species required food at regular intervals, and his metabolism was starting to consume his own muscle tissue. He'd lost weight in places that shouldn't lose weight, and his movements had taken on the languid quality of someone whose body was rationing energy like a miser counting coins. The camp's advanced technology, which could analyze atmospheric composition down to parts per billion, which could detect electromagnetic signatures from orbit, which could process complex quantum calculations in microseconds, was utterly useless for the simple problem of putting food in mouths. The molecular synthesizers required base materials they didn't have. The fabrication units needed power cells that were running dangerously low. The scanning equipment could identify thousands of potentially edible local species, but offered no practical advice on how to actually acquire and process them. It was, in the grand tradition of civilized species throughout the galaxy, a masterclass in over-specialization. They'd brought solutions for every conceivable problem except the oldest problem in existence, hunger. The portable shelter serving as their command center contained enough processing power to run a small space station, and currently all of it was dedicated to increasingly desperate searches through survival databases. Velkoth had pulled up files on primitive sustenance acquisition that read like archaeological reports, filled with terms like hunting-gathering societies and pre-technological food procurement that might as well have been describing ancient mythology. Zitkrik had suggested they attempt to trap some of the small creatures that occasionally skittered through camp, but nobody could figure out how. The database entries on trapping were filed under historical practices and contained more cultural context than practical instruction. One particularly unhelpful file spent 3 paragraphs discussing the sociological implications of snare designs on pre-spaceflight civilizations. Prism 5 had calculated that they could theoretically survive by consuming certain local plant matter, but the processing required would take more energy than they'd gain, which was just the universe's way of being spiteful. Kelos had identified several aquatic species in the nearby river that were biochemically compatible with most of their metabolisms, but when asked how to catch them, he'd simply gestured at the water, as if the answer was self-evident. It wasn't. The camp sat approximately 50 meters from a river that moved with the lazy confidence of a waterway that had been carving its path for millennia. The water ran clear enough to see the bottom in most places, and even the untrained observer could spot the occasional flash of movement beneath the surface. The riverbanks supported dense vegetation that ranged from ground cover to substantial trees, all of it thriving in the kind of ecosystem that practically screamed abundant resources here. To the expedition crew, it might as well have been a painted backdrop, pretty to look at, utterly useless for their purposes. Day 18 began with Velkoth calling an emergency meeting, which was somewhat redundant since the entire situation was an emergency and everyone was too weak to wander far anyway. They gathered in the command shelter, a collection of miserable beings from across the galaxy united in their shared incompetence at not dying. That's when the human finally spoke up. Marcus Chen had been the expedition's communications specialist responsible for maintaining their link with the orbital survey platform and managing the data transmissions back to civilization. He was technically the least essential crew member for planetary operations, which was probably why nobody had paid much attention to him for the past 2 days. He'd been notably absent from the increasingly frantic planning sessions, and when questioned had mumbled something about checking the perimeter before disappearing again. Now he stood in the entrance to the command shelter, and if the aliens had been more familiar with human expressions, they might have recognized the particular look that said someone was done with everyone's nonsense. "Right," Marcus said, in the tone of someone addressing a group of particularly slow children. "So we're all just going to starve to death next to a river full of fish, surrounded by edible plants because nobody thought to pack a fishing rod." The silence that followed was the kind that occurred when a statement was simultaneously incomprehensible and vaguely insulting. Velkoth's translator processed the words twice, as if suspecting an error. "Fishing rod. Yeah. You know. Fishing." Marcus made a casting motion that communicated absolutely nothing to his audience. "The thing where you catch fish. From the water. For food." Zitkrik's antenna twitched in confusion. The database indicates that fishing is a pre-technological food acquisition method practiced by civilizations lacking advanced resource management. The database, Marcus said slowly, is written by people who've apparently never been hungry. There are fish in that river. I'm going to catch some. Then I'm going to cook them. Then I'm going to eat them. Anyone who wants to join me is welcome, but I'm doing this regardless because I haven't eaten in 3 days and I'm tired of listening to everyone panic. He turned and walked out, leaving behind a collection of aliens who weren't entirely sure what had just happened. Prism 5 tilted her crystalline structure thoughtfully. Did the human just announce his intention to engage in primitive sustenance procurement? "I believe so," Velkoth said, his tone suggesting he wasn't sure if he should be concerned or hopeful. "Should we stop him?" "On what grounds?" Kelos bubbled from his position near the water recycler. "That he might actually find food." "I vote we let him try." 20 minutes later, a small crowd of aliens stood at a safe distance from the riverbank, watching Marcus work with the kind of fascination usually reserved for watching alien rituals. He'd raided the salvage from the crashed shuttle and was assembling something from spare cable, a piece of bent metal, and what looked like part of a calibration tool. "What is he constructing?" Zurkrik asked, her translator adding an undertone of scientific curiosity to her natural clicking language. According to the database, Prism 5 replied, her internal processors running overtime, that appears to be a rudimentary fishing implement. The metal piece serves as a hook, the cable as a line, and that length of composite material as a rod. The design dates back approximately 12,000 years in human development. Primitive, Zurkrik observed. Functional, Kelos corrected, watching as Marcus tested the flexibility of his improvised rod with a few experimental casts. Assuming he knows how to use it. Marcus, who could hear them perfectly well but had decided that responding would just encourage more questions, knelt by the riverbank and began examining the water with the kind of focused attention that suggested he actually knew what he was looking for. He noted the current speed, the depth variations, the places where the water moved differently, suggesting underwater features. He observed which areas the fish seemed to prefer, noting the shadows cast by overhanging vegetation. Then he dug around in the riverside soil until he found what he was looking for, something that wriggled. The aliens' collective noise of disgust was audible even over the river's burbling. Is he touching it?" Zurkrik's translator added a note of horror that transcended species barriers. Marcus attached the worm to his hook, stood, and cast the line into a promising spot where the current created a small eddy near a submerged rock. The improvised weight carried it down, and then he simply waited. This was apparently the most confusing part for the aliens. "What is he doing now?" Prism 5 asked after 30 seconds of inactivity. "Waiting, apparently," Velkoth said, consulting his datapad. "The process requires patience. The fish must be attracted to the bait, mistake it for food, and ingest the hook. At which point, the barbed design prevents easy removal and the human can extract the fish from its environment." "That seems unnecessarily complicated," Zurkrik observed. "Why not use a sonic stunner to disorient the fish, then collect them with a net?" "Don't have a sonic stunner," Marcus called back without turning around. "Don't have a net either. Do have some wire and patience. Feel free to try your method if you've got the equipment." The aliens lapsed into silence, watching the utterly bizarre spectacle of a sentient being standing motionless by water, holding a stick. Then the line jerked. Marcus's reaction was immediate and practiced, setting the hook with a sharp pull, then beginning the process of reeling in his catch. The improvised reel was just the cable wrapped around the rod, requiring him to handline it in, but the principle was sound. Something fought on the other end, creating visible tension in the line and ripples on the water's surface. "He's caught something." Kelos surged forward, his aquatic instincts overriding his exhaustion. "That's a thornback river swimmer, approximately 2 kilograms, excellent protein content, low toxin load." The fish emerged from the water thrashing, and Marcus grabbed it with the confidence of someone who'd done this many times before. He removed the hook, examined his catch with satisfaction, and held it up for the assembled aliens to see. "Dinner," he announced. Kelos made a sound that the translator rendered as distressed burbling. "But that's a living creature, a sentient ecosystem participant. You can't just, it's not sentient, it's a fish," Marcus interrupted, already baiting his hook again. "And yes, I absolutely can. Watch." Over the next hour, Marcus caught 4 more fish, each one prompting renewed philosophical debates among the aliens about the ethics of consuming other living organisms. the primitiveness of the method, and whether this technically violated several interstellar treaties about disturbing native ecosystems. Marcus ignored all of it, focused on the simple ancient task of acquiring food. By the time he'd caught his fifth fist, even the most squeamish aliens had to admit that his pile of actual, real, tangible food was significantly more impressive than their pile of theories and regulations. "Right," Marcus said, gathering his catch. "Next step, cooking. Who wants to help me build a fire?" If catching fish had been controversial, this suggestion caused an actual crisis. "Absolutely not." Velkoth's scales flared in alarm. "Open combustion is prohibited under Safety Regulation 47B. The atmospheric particulate dispersal alone will be completely harmless on a planet with active weather patterns and no enclosed spaces," Marcus finished. "Look, Commander, I appreciate that you've got rules for everything, but those rules were written by people who had other options. We don't, so I'm going to build a fire, cook these fish and eat them. You're welcome to file a formal complaint after we're rescued, but fire is..." Zekrik struggled to find the words. "It's barbaric. No civilized species has cooked with open flame in millennia. Then consider this a valuable anthropological experience," Marcus said cheerfully, already gathering dry wood from the riverside. "You can write a paper about it. Observations of primitive human thermal food processing. I'm sure it'll be fascinating." The fire-building process drew even more attention than the fishing, primarily because half the crew was convinced they were about to witness a disaster, while the other half was morbidly curious. Marcus constructed a simple fire pit using rocks from the riverbank, arranged his tinder and kindling with practiced efficiency, and then produced a small piece of salvaged electronics that could generate a spark. "At least he's using technology for something," Prism 5 observed. "Only for ignition," Velkoth noted, watching as Marcus coaxed the spark into a small flame, then fed it carefully until it grew. "The rest is pure combustion chemistry. I haven't seen an open flame outside of historical demonstrations." The fire caught and grew, crackling happily in the way that fires do, and the aliens instinctively backed away. Fire was dangerous. Fire was uncontrolled. Fire was something that civilized beings had moved beyond, confining thermal energy to controlled reactors and precisely calibrated heating elements. Marcus just fed it another stick and started preparing the fish. The preparation process involved a knife from his personal kit and knowledge that clearly wasn't coming from any database. He cleaned the fish with efficient movements, removing the parts that weren't edible, and fashioned improvised skewers from green branches that wouldn't burn immediately. Then he did something that made Kelos avert his eyes. He examined the vegetation near the river, selected several plant types and crushed them over the fish. "What is he doing now?" Zekrik whispered. "Seasoning," Prism 5 said, her processors working to identify the plants. "He's adding aromatic compounds to enhance flavor. Those are local herbs. My database indicates they're biochemically inert, but contain various organic molecules that affect taste perception." Velkoth asked. "I don't see him using a scanner." "Smell, probably," Kelos said quietly. "And maybe taste. Humans are remarkably good at sensory identification of food sources. It's part of their evolutionary heritage." Marcus placed the fish on the skewers and positioned them over the fire, rotating them slowly. And that's when everything changed. The smell hit them in waves. None of the aliens had ever experienced anything quite like it. Their sophisticated diets consisted of nutritionally optimized compounds delivered in the most efficient forms possible. Taste was a minor consideration, something to make consumption pleasant but hardly a priority. Food was fuel, carefully balanced and precisely formulated. This was something else entirely. The aroma of cooking fish, of browning proteins and caramelizing surfaces, of herbs releasing their volatile compounds in the heat, of smoke and char, and fundamental chemical reactions that humans had been exploiting for hundreds of thousands of years. It hit every alien's olfactory system like a revelation. Zhushkrik's antenna went rigid. "What is that smell?" "Cooking," Marcus said, rotating the fish. "Chemistry and fire. Maillard reactions, protein denaturation, aromatic compound release. Your database probably has all the technical details." "The database doesn't mention it smells like that," Prism 5 said, moving closer despite herself. Her species didn't traditionally eat, but she had chemical sensors that were suddenly very interested in what was happening. Velkoth's earlier alarm about fire safety had vanished, replaced by a look of intense focus on the cooking fish. His species had an excellent sense of smell, evolved for detecting prey and predators, and every instinct was now screaming that food was nearby. Real food. Hot food. Delicious food. Kelos emerged fully from his tank, dragging himself forward on his manipulator appendages, pulled by an imperative older than civilization. "Is it ready? Can we eat it? Please tell me we can eat it." "Almost," Marcus said, checking the fish with the practiced eye of someone who'd cooked outdoors more times than he could count. "Another minute. You want to make sure it's cooked through." That minute felt like an hour. The aliens clustered around the fire, drawn by something primal that bypassed every layer of civilization and culture and technological advancement. They were hungry, the smell was incredible, and every biological system they possessed was screaming at them to eat. Marcus pulled the first fish off the fire, let it cool for a moment, then pulled off a piece and ate it. The expression on his face was pure satisfaction. "Okay," he said after swallowing. "Who wants some?" The rush forward was entirely undignified. Velkoth, who'd been worried about fire safety 20 minutes ago, practically shoved Zhushkrik aside to get closer. Prism 5 extended crystalline manipulators with uncharacteristic eagerness. Even Kelos, who'd been philosophically opposed to the entire enterprise, grabbed a piece before anyone else could claim it. The first bites produced silence. Complete, absolute silence as every alien's sensory system tried to process what was happening. Velkoth, whose species had been eating nutritionally balanced protein blocks for 3,000 years, experienced actual flavor for the first time in his life. The texture of the fish, the char from the fire, the herbs Marcus had added, his neural pathways lit up in ways that no optimized meal had ever achieved. He made a sound that the translator simply gave up on, displaying only intranslatable positive exclamation. Zhushkrik discovered that her species' taste receptors, vestigial as they were, still functioned. The fish was warm. Warm. When had she last eaten something that wasn't exactly room temperature? The heat added an entirely new dimension to eating, and she found herself reaching for another piece before she'd finished the first. Prism 5, who didn't technically need to eat at all, absorbed minute particles of the cooked fish and experienced molecular structures her databases hadn't prepared her for. The complexity was staggering. Thousands of compounds created by heat and reaction, each one distinct, combining into something her processors wanted to categorize as delicious, even though that wasn't a scientific term. Kelos had a religious experience. His species worshipped the great ocean currents of their home world, and somewhere in his theology there was probably something about not eating fish, but at this moment he genuinely didn't care. The third piece went down even faster than the second, and he found himself apologizing to the fish between bites. "I'm sorry," he bubbled. "You're delicious, and I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Can I have more?" Marcus distributed the fish with the air of someone who'd expected exactly this reaction. He'd seen it before, on other worlds with other species. You could achieve technological wonders, you could cross the galaxy, you could build civilizations that spanned star systems, but you couldn't engineer away the simple pleasure of a hot meal cooked over an open fire. The feast continued until every bit of fish was gone, consumed by aliens who'd forgotten they were supposed to be sophisticated representatives of advanced civilizations. They sat around the fire, which Marcus kept fed with fresh wood, in a silence that was comfortable rather than awkward. Finally, Velkoth spoke. "I need to include this in my report." "Good luck explaining it," Marcus said, prodding the fire with a stick. "How's that going to read?" "Crisis resolved through application of primitive thermal food processing techniques," something like that. Velkoth looked at his empty hands, where he'd been holding fish moments before. "I don't suppose you could teach the rest of us how to do this? The fishing or the cooking?" "Both, all of it, everything." The commander's scales had regained some of their normal color, and his voice had lost the edge of panic that had characterized it for days. "We're supposed to be here another week, even with rescue coming. I'd rather not spend it hungry." Marcus grinned. "Sure, fishing's easy once you get the hang of it. Fire's even easier. The tricky part is knowing what you can eat and what'll kill you, but I've been studying the local ecosystem. There's a lot more here than just fish." Over the next few days the camp transformed. Marcus became the unintentional survival instructor, teaching a crew of advanced aliens the basics that their civilizations had forgotten. Zushkrik turned out to have a natural talent for fishing, her multiple manipulator appendages giving her excellent line control. Prism 5 couldn't fish, but she could identify edible plants with her advanced sensors, and Marcus taught her what to look for beyond just biochemically compatible. Velkoth learned to cook, discovering that leadership skills translated surprisingly well to managing a fire and coordinating meal preparation. Kelos overcame his ethical crisis by declaring that consuming lower-order aquatic life was acceptable if one offered proper spiritual acknowledgement first, then proceeded to eat fish with enthusiasm at every meal. The fire became a permanent feature of the camp, carefully maintained and fed. The aliens learned to appreciate the warmth, the light, the simple pleasure of gathering around flames the way their ancestors must have, millions of years ago before technology gave them easier options. When rescue finally arrived on day 23, the rescue team found a camp that didn't look like it had been suffering from a resource crisis. They found well-fed expedition members cooking fresh fish over an open fire, surrounded by evidence of successful foraging, looking healthier than most crews at the end of a standard mission. The rescue coordinator, a Valthori, who'd expected to find desperate survivors, stared at the scene in confusion. "Commander Velkoth, we received your distress signal about food shortage. Status." Velkoth, who was turning fish skewers over the fire with practiced competence, looked up. The situation was resolved through alternative resource acquisition methods. Alternative, the coordinator's translator struggled with the concept. "You mean you synthesized nutrients from local materials?" "Not exactly." Velkoth gestured at the river, the fire, the fish. "We learned to fish. To fish. And cook. And forage. The human taught us." Velkoth said it matter-of-factly, as if it was the most natural thing in the galaxy. "Would you like some?" "We have plenty." The coordinator spent the flight back trying to write a report that made sense. "How did you officially document that an expedition's survival had depended on skills that dated back to the Paleolithic era? How did you explain that the most primitive member of the crew had been the most capable? How did you justify that open flame cooking, which was against at least a dozen regulations, had been the key to survival?" In the end, The report simply stated that the expedition had adapted to local conditions using available resources and traditional human knowledge, which was technically accurate, even if it completely failed to capture the reality of the situation. Marcus, for his part, submitted his communications logs as usual, and added a personal note suggesting that maybe, just maybe, survival training should include something more practical than wait for rescue and try not to die. The note was filed, reviewed, and probably ignored by someone in a comfortable office who'd never been hungry a day in their life. But word spread, as word does. The story of the expedition that survived through fishing and fire became one of those tales that circulated through the galactic community, gaining embellishments and losing accuracy with each retelling. Some versions claimed the human had defeated dangerous predators. Others suggested he'd discovered lost ancient technology. A few implied he'd performed actual magic. The truth was simpler and somehow more impressive. A human had been hungry, so he'd caught some fish and cooked them because that's what humans did. They didn't need fancy technology or complex databases or emergency protocols. They just needed a river, some wire, and the accumulated knowledge of a species that had spent most of its existence figuring out how not to starve. Velkoth kept fishing after returning to civilization. It became a hobby, something he did to relax, much to the confusion of his peers. When asked why, he'd gesture to his collection of improvised fishing equipment and say, because sometimes the solution to a problem isn't more technology. Sometimes it's just a hook and some patience. Jekrik wrote a paper about human survival adaptations that became required reading in several xenobiology programs. It carefully avoided the word primitive and instead used phrases like elegantly simple and highly effective across diverse environments. Prism 5 added a new subroutine to her personality matrix, appreciation for non-optimized experiences. She started seeking out things that were messy, inefficient, and fundamentally unnecessary, discovering that sometimes value couldn't be quantified in database entries. Kalos established the first interspecies fishing club, which met monthly and had a surprisingly diverse membership. The club's motto, roughly translated, was "We remember the river," which meant more to members who'd been there than it did to outsiders. And Marcus? He went back to being a communications specialist, doing his job competently and rarely thinking about his brief stint as a survival instructor. When people asked him about the Viridian 7 incident, he'd shrug and say it wasn't that complicated. Anyone could have done it, and wasn't it kind of obvious that you could eat fish from a river? The galaxy, in its infinite complexity and technological sophistication, didn't have a good answer to that. They'd built quantum computers and mastered faster-than-light travel and established civilizations across thousands of worlds, but they'd somehow forgotten that fish were edible and fire made food taste better. Humanity, still using pointed sticks and controlled combustion after all these millennia, still eating things they pulled from water and cooked over flames, remained the species that never quite fit into civilized society's neat categories. Too primitive to take seriously, too effective to ignore, too practical to fail at the simple things that everyone else had overcomplicated into uselessness. Somewhere, on dozens of worlds, in hundreds of training programs, in thousands of emergency protocols, someone quietly added a line item: consider human solutions to resource acquisition challenges. It wasn't an admission of inadequacy, it wasn't a revolutionary change in thinking. It was just a practical acknowledgement that sometimes, when everyone else was starving next to abundant resources, the species still making fires and catching fish with bent wire was probably onto something. The universe continued its expansion, civilizations rose and fell, technology advanced in ways that would have seemed like magic to earlier generations. And through it all, humans kept fishing, kept cooking over fires, kept doing things the hard way because the hard way worked, and they never ever skipped a meal.